are we hoping to get from it? Basically, I want to be able to tailor this a little bit. What I have put together can scale based on the overall experience of the audience. And I was kind of hoping to get an idea of where you guys would like to start.
I guess I'd just like to hear what is our common base. It seems like even now our definition of what a particular phrase means is still changing. The basic ones are pretty much the same: advanced contact, um, things like that. But we seem to still have an issue about some of the various charge commands, for example, and then some overview of what the current Callantyr Army structure is.
Okay.
I mean, I'm still used to the whole 3 companies thing, and that doesn't seem to be the case anymore.
So quickly, I'll try to address some of that. It's a little off target for where I was going, but I'm happy to address it, and they're good questions. So within the current Callantyr Army, the War Council and with working with the Crown and several other generals throughout time have put together several documents that are available on the War Council page, which I'm happy to share as my turn ends and John's begins. That way I can go look it up for you, and I'll post it in the comments section here. But we are still working on a 3-company premise most of the time, depending on numbers. We see our 3 companies at Gulf Wars, where we tend to have a larger audience. Penzik has a slightly smaller army, so we reduce our size, or at least the total number of companies at that war, just to allow us to build some weight to those moving teams. As far as the overall command structures and the commands, those are also codified within the documents that the War Council has put together, and I'll be happy to share it here in just a little bit.
I already got it for you, Your Majesty.
Awesome, thank you. So the link that John just posted, if you follow it, it kind of has the current war manual and how the Army operates. And I'm sorry I didn't answer your question in a little bit more detail, Logan. I am aiming a little bit more of how to command the Callantyr Army and exercises and lessons that a person can take away, and especially right now while we're at home, to get a little bit better or to educate themselves on how to prepare to take over tactical command of a Callantyr Army.
Excellent information to provide, Your Majesty. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to do it. So I'll jump in, I guess, if there aren't any reason to hold back. We're a little bit, we're just a little bit after 7 o'clock. Are we ready to really start?
Yes.
Perfect. I'll take that as a yes. So a lot of this is gathered, a lot of the information that I'm going to present is gathered over time through a couple of different books. And I provided a link here in the chat window if anyone wants to follow along with most of these thoughts. It might be a good reference. But mastery of anything takes about 10,000 hours, is the common thinking. Getting mastery of tactical command in the SCA by experience alone, over 10,000 hours is not going to happen. I don't know that any of us has 10,000 hours on the battlefield, let alone 10,000 hours of experience in the situation. So looking for opportunities to apprentice. I personally apprenticed kind of to Donngal, to Rolf, to Joe Angus, to Angus of Blackmore. These guys really kind of got me super interested in these topics. And this is one of the only fields within the SCA that you can get partial credit for somebody else's work against those 10,000 hours by by reading, by the reading list that I included here, and we'll go over some of these books, by playing the war games that someone else has created, by looking at the historical accounts, whether they're in print or on YouTube. You can gather this information and disseminate it and build yourself a tactical philosophy that is easily implemented once you kind of have the base structure. With that, there are a handful of books and reading that I put together that I want to talk about really quickly. I have pictures of them for you so that they're easy to find. The Roots of Strategy, it looks like it's backwards in the image, I'm sorry. This is a book edited by Brigadier General Terry Phillips, and it is a collection of 5 of the most famous authors of strategy through all time. Sun Tzu, Aegetius, Tissot, Friedrich, and Napoleon. The Book of Five Rings, which we've talked about in previous classes. This is not necessarily a strategy or even a tactical guide, but great lessons on how a strategic or a tactical person thinks. And then The Prince and the Art of War by Machiavelli. Again, same thing, not really necessarily a guide in strategy or is going to give you specific details, but it kind of helps frame the way a person might think. There's also a website included in the reading material that's difficult to show you, digitaladdict.org/war. That includes the foundation of Army operations provided by the U.S. Army, as well as a breakdown of the 7 basic maneuvers of warfare, which is a great place to start. Play chess, play Go, play Warhammer, play poker, any game that might give you an opportunity to assess your opponent or to assess a field, also great resources. And then finally, the most important book, in my opinion, for anyone who's going to take command of the Callantyr Army is the Sight Book. If you don't know what the battles are, what the winning objectives are, or the victory conditions are, you can't command the army. And I went through that super fast. I know we were just talking about resources, but are there any questions about those resources?
You're going to provide, or you have provided links to those somewhere?
Yeah, so in the first link in the chat is actually a link to a Google document that I put together, and in it is this reading list, as well as kind of an overview of all the things we're going to talk about tonight.
Perfect. Thank you, Your Majesty.
My pleasure. All right, so kind of the first highlight, and it's kind of important to say, at least in my opinion, when you're developing an overall tactical philosophy, especially for SCA combat. As an SCA general, using quotes, there's not really a comparison to a modern or even a historical general. In a modern context, your role is going to be more of a battalion commander, maybe a lieutenant colonel, right? In that way, you're not deciding your own battlefields. Those are going to be told to you. You're not going to decide when you're going to fight. That's going to be told to you. You're not even going to be told what it's going to take to win. Someone's going to tell that to you. Your job is to make sure that your troops and your companies are well maintained, that they're deployed correctly, that you've communicated with them well. To do that, you have to put the Callantyr Army specifically into some context. This is a volunteer army. They're not regulars. Do we have a question here? We're not looking at regulars. These are people who are spending their vacations to go have fun. They're not going to give up their fun if they think what they're doing is stupid. They're not going to give up their fun if they're tired, if they're exhausted. You're going to have to, in some ways, be a cheerleader. Again, the Calentier Army in specific always fights better with a bloody nose. We have to kind of get slapped around the first time. Once we do, we always seem to spring back. So if you're new to command and Calentier, don't let that dishearten you. Just be aware of it. And then this is a constant joke about those who have been in command multiple times of the Calentier Army, but the greatest strength of the Calentier Army is that it can be led by anybody, and the greatest weakness of the Calentier Army is that it can be led by anybody. What that means really is that if you're the general of Calentier, you need to be a strong presence or delegate that responsibility, the local command, to your sergeants and to your command staff so that they can remain in charge. If at some point in time the Army feels like they're not being led, they'll take over and they'll lead themselves. Which leads me to my last point on the subject. A new commander sometimes has a hard time letting go of some of the details of command. If you spend any amount of time telling your troops how to achieve an objective, you're going to spend all day answering questions. You are much better off telling them what the objective is and how you need them to, or where you need them to go to achieve it, and let them come up with the answer of how. We're all pretty well trained for irregulars, for volunteer soldiers. And so, again, if they think the how is stupid, they're going to ask questions all day. That was a lot of words to say that we're stubborn Midwesterners and that we're all just trying to have a good time. Are there questions about my assessment of the Calentier Army? Okay. Then we can probably get into some of the specific tactical command stuff. The U.S. Army breaks down tactical command into 9 different categories that are all interrelated, and they're difficult to separate. But addressing them individually is a great way to conceptualize them as you're doing your own reading, as you're doing your own research. And those categories are objective, offense, mass, economy of force, maneuver, unity of command, security, surprise, and simplicity. And we'll go through each of those here in brief with plenty of time for questions for each. Thank you. The tenets of tactical command. The first one is objective. In SCA combat, there are really only 3 melee victory conditions. There's take and hold, capture the flag, and last man standing. There aren't a whole lot of victory conditions available to us. How those are deployed, how they're used, whether it's on a bridge or a field or a castle, there are lots of different ways those can be manipulated, but there are only the 3. Focusing on that at the beginning of the battle, making sure everybody knows what the objective is key as a tactical commander. If they don't know what the victory condition is, they're going to be distracted by the fighting. The fighting is not the objective of the battle. The fighting is just the tool of achieving the objective. Let's, at least as we step through these, let's see if there are questions on each one. Then we'll move on to the offensive. Very simply, offensive is the concerted effort to keep attacking forward and taking ground. Donngal made a great point a couple of weeks ago that we've always said if you're going to die, die moving forwards, and that's not wrong, but it's not quite right. Die attacking forwards. Don't forget to swing. You do still need to get to your objective, and so long as your opponent's standing, it'll be more difficult. Mass is probably the most complex one, I think, here. This is the use of your command to affect positive outcomes. To use an example here, to gain mass on the field isn't, and I want to be specific, it's not necessarily just weight, it's not just numbers, but it's using your numbers effectively. Forming a killing pocket is gaining mass. You've managed to put more killing edges on your target than they can put on you. Using the shield wall the way that we typically use the Callantyr shield wall. Shields up front, polearms behind them, spears behind them, allows you to put more killing edges on your opponent than they can put on you. And again, I'm going through these really quickly. I want to have the opportunity for questions because mass is the complex one.
What about just actual physical mass?
So,
and the fact that you've got huge guys against not so huge guys.
No, so that's true, right? And the literal mass of your army is in here, but it's not specifically what it is. The size of my guys is part of the force at my command, and using them to affect a positive outcome towards my objective is the mass that we're speaking of in this context.
May I add a little bit, Your Majesty?
Absolutely, please.
So speaking specifically, so we'll go back to the modern concept of it, like how the U.S. Army uses it. But that helps to illustrate, I think, how we want to use it in the SCA, right? And so doctrinally, when they talk about mass, you're not talking about numbers, because so going back to rock, paper, scissors, if you're just using numbers to gain mass, that's basically having a bigger rock than the other guy. So and modernly speaking, you're talking about mass is adding more effects, combat effects in a single spot, right? And there are ways that we achieve this. And so you think about effects, and artillery is artillery, right? Ours is shorter range, obviously, than the modern armies. But we use that in a certain way. A column charge has an effect, right? It compresses a line in a certain way. It does that. We know, sort of at least instinctively, right, that when you follow up column charges, you kill a lot of guys, because what you are doing is you are massing effects, because you are first compressing the line with that charge of guys, and then following that with guys with big pointy things that can like really rapidly throw a lot of shots and kill a lot of people. A killing pocket at the end of a bridge battle is a good way to achieve mass, right? Because you create a salient that they have to move up into, and then you get more sticks on target in a given spot. So.
No, thank you. You touched on a point that I think is kind of important too, is that instead of thinking of mass as the total number of people, it's the total number of positive effects. Forming that killing pocket allows you to get more of your weapons in range, which allows you to take advantage of the fact that now there are fewer of them, and so your charges are going to be slightly more effective, which allows you to take advantage of being able to split up their people and get greater numerical advantage, and those things compound.
So what do you call the opposite when it's you have the negative effects?
I don't, maybe Dirk or Donngal will have to help me out here. The opposite of mass. I think maybe the opposite of mass is just beaten.
Well, I mean, that might be something you have to overcome, but that's right. So he's talking about right now, these are tenets, right? These are basic concepts that you as a commander should have in your brain, and you should always be thinking of ways to create and use these concepts to create ways for your guys to kick the other guy's ass.
You mind if I throw something in there real quick?
Sure.
So, when discussing mass and stuff, which I guess the reduction of that, you're just talking about gaining or losing mass towards that end. But a term that also gets used a lot that kind of applies to that situation is something being a force multiplier, which some people have an easier time understanding the concept of mass in regards to tactics. So that might be a way also to put that information out there to help people kind of learn that stuff. Whereas like in a modern doctrine, for example, like if you were to deploy a sniper to a combat zone, that would be considered a force multiplier. And it's not that you're adding a bunch of guys, it's that you're adding one type of tactic that's going to have a larger effect than its individual self, basically.
You're not wrong, at least comparing the two, but I think you might be a little off target, right? So using a force multiplier as a way of achieving mass.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying is basically it's kind of showing that that is a means to, not the same. But
Okay.
it's a way to realize how you might gain mass, whereas saying like a killing pocket, for example, would be a way to gain mass in that way.
No, it's a good point. Like I said, this one is by and large the most confusing, and it's partially a vocabulary issue. But I'm happy to spend a little bit more time on it if we need to.
So the last thing I would add, I'm sorry, Your Majesty,
Please.
if you're talking about, yeah, force multipliers, they are mass, right? But if you have a sniper, like that's already part of your army. So his multiplication is already factored into the overall point count of your army when you throw those miniatures on the battlefield, right? Mass is talking about applying that to a very specific portion of that battlefield to achieve a very specific effect, right? It's not just that you want your sniper to go shoot a bunch of guys, because if he's shooting all the wrong guys, or, you know, guys that don't really matter, then a bunch of goblins made their lookout sir roll and it doesn't really matter.
Right.
No, and this is actually not a terrible example, right? If you're talking about the Gulf War's Ravine battle, you don't have our archers go and shoot any old shieldman. You have him targeting Donngal. You have him targeting Dirk with a great sword. You have him targeting, you know, you take out their commanders. That's the achievement of mass in this example. So we're about 25 minutes in, so I'm going to move on really quickly, if no one minds, to economy of force, and really just defining this quickly. The economy of force is the judicious employment of and distribution of your forces. Only send 5 guys if you only need to send 5 guys. Don't send 10 when 5 will do. Maneuver. Maneuver is a little bit limited in the modern context to an SCA battlefield, just because we're on a limited size field. But what you can do is maneuver the right number of troops to achieve mass to a specific area and maneuver your opponent into a less desirable position, whether that's catching them on the downhill side in the field battle, or whether that's forcing them to make a long march back and forth to res point. Unity of command is, at least in my mind, a little bit different here than it is in the modern context. In an SCA instance, we're talking about communications. We're talking about clear communication from the very top, the general of the army, to the newest guy there. They have to know what the objective is. They have to know why the objective is. And to add to it a little bit, effective local commanders that truly understand what those objectives are, and given the discretion to make local choices to best achieve those objectives. Um, so long as everybody's on the same page with what it is they're attempting to do, giving away that discretion to your commanders is a good thing in this scenario, rather than trying to control them very tightly. Security, in a lot of ways, is kind of the opposite of maneuver. And the way that I equate this one in an SCA scenario is that whatever action the commander has his army take is going to generate a reaction. Being secure in the idea that you know what that reaction is going to be will allow you to kind of foresee it. I had a little bit more there, but it has slipped my mind. And then the final two are surprise. Surprise has very limited aspect on an SCA battlefield, but there are things that we can do and have done. A great example here is show up at war with a new style of war shield that everybody calls a Scutari. Your enemy is not prepared for it. Have an entire unit take a knee behind your front ranks, and they essentially disappear from the battlefield, keeping spears low so they can't be counted, this kind of thing. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, is simplicity. The plan needs to be very, very simple and needs to be communicated in clear, plain English so that it is consumable by everybody. And I've taken up my whole half hour just kind of getting through those 9. And they, like I said, they're all pretty interrelated and they're pretty complex, but also pretty easy at the same time. So I encourage you all to, if you're still interested after this presentation, to pursue some of that reading, parse that reading into these 9 items, these 9 tenets, and attempt to build your own tactical philosophy and what it would take to lead Callantyr Army, and I'd be happy to discuss it with you further. Before we turn it over to John, are there any questions about that? Any of those items or how they relate? Perfect, thank you.
Thank you.
Boyer, I think you're on mute.
Hey, I am. Thank you, Your Majesty. Appreciate the backup there. So my part in this whole thing is taking a step down from the overall command structure into the sergeant's role. Being a sergeant in the military for many years, it introduced me to what a sergeant truly does. If you take a look through the paper, you'll see a few quotes there that I've pulled out. Dwight D. Eisenhower once said that the sergeant is the Army. And that is the case. Anybody who's been in command, who's led troops, knows that a good sergeant is worth his weight in salt. And so in the Callantyr Army, I've had the fortune of being a sergeant at Gulf Wars and learning the duties and responsibilities and actually applying what I learned in the real world to the SCA combat world. And it works very, very well. So what is the role of the sergeant? They're the communication link. They're the ones that are going to be communicating to the troops from the company commanders, from the generals, and making sure that what the overall strategy and tactical vision of those commanders are into actual deeds and actions on the field. A sergeant needs to have several different qualities, and I'm going to go through some of those qualities. They need to be one of the most important things. They need to be able to think on their feet and be able to fall into the role above them. So if you have a sergeant who doesn't know what he's doing, and you are the captain or lieutenant, and you suddenly die or have to walk back to the res point, you need a sergeant that's going to be able to take over, know the role, know the responsibilities and what the tactics are, and employ them until you can return. But honestly, I think the most important role for a sergeant is to look after the fighters. The fighters are the strength of the Army, just as the sergeant is the key point of the Army. A sergeant needs to be able to walk through the troops, keep the cohesion and the morale up, make sure that they're staying hydrated, keeping cool, checking on their conditions, assisting them in making that right choice. Do I continue fighting in 102-degree heat with all my armor on, or do I need to sit back and take a break so I can fight the next round or fight tomorrow? It may not be a popular choice, or it may not be a popular decision to convince a fighter to do that, but it's going to be the right one, the safe one. The economy of force, it follows that. A sergeant should take the initiative. One of the things that I do when I was on the field as a sergeant, it was form up the company. The minute you step on that field, that company falls under you, and it falls under the commander. Now, the commander will probably be off talking with the general, getting last minute orders and things like that, but it's up to the sergeant to actually form the command, get them in some sort of shape, even if they don't have the hats and bats right then and there. Get them in the position so that they know where they're standing, they know what the formation is, they know who they're standing next to, and so that everything is ready to go the moment they say 5 minutes. Because there's nothing worse than sitting there, having people trying to put their helmets on in 5 minutes and not being able to, or they have something wrong with their gear or harness, and you need to get them going, or they need to step off because it's going to be unsafe for them to keep going. Sergeants need to be prepared. They need to walk through the company. They need to make sure the company's prepared as they are. They need to make sure that the company has the right mix of weapons. His Majesty was talking about, making sure that we meet this scenario and make sure that we have the right mix of weapons. The sergeant's going to be the one that tells Johnny Newstick, hey, sorry, you really shouldn't fight with 2 sticks on this scenario. You need a sword and shield, or you need a spear, or you need a mass weapon of some type. And be able to convince them to do that. You should be checking your fighter's armor, making sure that they're good to go, or conducting buddy checks. Have partners, have people team up to each other and check, make sure that the weapons are ready, armor is ready, and that the fighters are ready to go. Another emphasis on sergeants is their communication skills, and not following 4-letter word communication skills, but actually be able to repeat commands and get the commands across. We talked about commands, and I saw a few questions on it about commands. The command is 2 steps. It's the preparatory and then the command of execution. The preparatory basically wakes everybody up. Hey, they're talking about us, or hey, get ready to do this. And then the command of execution is the actual command. Callan, we have excellent background of communication. That is what makes us one of the strongest armies out there. I've been in a few different armies and watched, and nobody does communication like we do. A few try, and unless they practice it like we do, nobody can really meet us once we are communicating. It does wonders for the Army and cohesion when you have fighters repeating commands back as they're being sounded by a sergeant or by the commander. When you're, as a sergeant, when you're running a company or a group and you're having to produce commands, you can wear your voice out very, very early, very quickly by not utilizing your diaphragm. If you're a singer, you know how to sing your loudest through using your diaphragm and good vocal techniques. And that's very important as a sergeant, because nothing's worse than having a sergeant who's whispering at you because he can't speak at the end of the day. So you need to make sure that you utilize your diaphragm, your breathing techniques properly, and really making it sound well. Another tip and technique that we learned in NCO academies is when giving a loud command that you should project it in a lower tone. There's nothing worse than a high piercing shriek coming out of a sergeant, unless you're in the British Army, and then that's normal. But by lowering your voice down a few octaves, it really helps the projection, really helps the clarity of the command. And I'm scrolling through my paper here. So a fighter, I came across this brilliant quote from one of my favorite movies, and it was really from an outtake of it. In Gods and Generals, Sergeant Buster Kilrain, the second Maine, was talking to another sergeant, and he says, a sergeant never fires his weapon until the men in front of him are killed, and then only if he wants to show off. And to me, that is the epitome of a sergeant. As a sergeant, I always position myself in the third or fourth row. I armed myself with a great sword and a mace or a hammer. And I got more kills out of my hammer by people coming through the line and me just crushing their noggins with it. And if they didn't take the noggin shot, if they kept going past me, they got it on the rear end, and they pretty much sat down pretty quickly right after that. But a sergeant, when you're forming a company, a sergeant should be in the front, because that's where he needs to be. He needs to line up the company. He needs to look the company over, make sure that everything is where it's supposed to be, and people are where they are needing to be lined up. He needs to be able to align the company. So standing in the front of the company during formation is where he should be. Military-wise, a sergeant is always at the front until it's time for the commander to take over. Then he takes a step to the rear. And in Napoleonic times, that was to act as a file closer, to make sure that troops weren't trying to run out the back door, weren't trying to get out, or to look at the holes in the line and shove more people in. And that's the same exact role that our sergeants should be doing. Looking for the gaps in the line, shoving people in those gaps, trying to keep the line straight and going. Being able to stand back and recognize the different points that they need to be at. As a sergeant in third or fourth row, it also gives you a space to where you can sit back and look over the lines and see that other charge forming up on the other side, and be able to prepare your army to receive that charge, or to be able to redirect anybody that might need to go and strengthen that portion of the line to be ready to receive the charge. So, as a sergeant, you should spend your time in the line as much as possible. And by being in the third or fourth rank, you're doing that. If you're walking back and forth to the spawn point, or if you're standing on the front line swinging a stick, you're not doing your job. All right, for force structure, a sergeant is really critical and crucial to the force structure of the Army. They're going to be the ones that are making sure that the spears, the mass weapons, and the shields are in the right place, and that we're utilizing the right numbers. He's going to be translating and communicating the battle plans from the commanders to the Army. So he's going to be the one making sure that force structure is meeting what the intent of the Army commander is. It's also a sergeant's responsibility to know and understand the formations and be able to assemble them in the proper formation prior to the battle. Along with force structure, a sergeant is responsible for maintaining the combat effectiveness of the company. And one of the ways I did this was I took 4 or 5 guys that I knew and that I could trust, guys equals fighters, and said, okay, I need you guys to be our reserve. I need you to be ready to jump in a hole and take care of that. And I would tell the commander that these are your reserve. These are who's going to be your file closers. And in a respawn scenario, that's great. You can utilize them, and then as more fighters come back in, you can gather 4 or 5 more fighters and position them where you want them, and say, okay, now your guys are the reserve. So whenever the commander takes the reserve and plugs a hole in the line, say in the ravine battle, you have another set of reserves ready to go. And these reserves can also be utilized as a counter charge or a basis for charge, whatever the commander needs them for. But it's really the sergeant's responsibility to make sure that's ready to go and organized. There's a lot of work really to being a sergeant in order to be effective. We talked about decisions. Theodore Roosevelt once said, in any moment of decision, the best thing you can do is the right thing. Next best thing is the wrong thing. And the worst thing you can do is nothing. And I truly believe that, making no decision is worse than making a bad decision, because you can live off of a bad decision. You can learn from it. Making no decision, it could be as minimal as missing an opportunity to seize the point early in the game, or it can be as drastic as actually losing the entire scenario because a decision wasn't made at the right point. A good case in point is the decision of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, 2nd Maine, on Little Round Top. Running out of ammunition, what does he do? Well, he doesn't stand there and say, I don't know what to do. He forms the lines, fixed bayonets, and charges down the hill, wiping out the Alabama regiment that's below him. That's the example of taking the time to make a decision. The final skill that a sergeant should really have, that I'm going to talk on, is how to be a follower. It's very important for a sergeant to follow what his commander puts forward as the doctrine for the fight. The tactics, the strategy. If a sergeant doesn't believe in those items, he should never show that in front of the troops. If he has questions about it, if he has a point of order to make to the commander, he should really take that separately off privately to one side and say, hey, sir, hey, Captain, whoever, I don't believe that we're able to do this because of X, Y, Z, or I think that there's a better way or a smarter way of achieving these goals, and talking to him about it. Saying, oh, we got to go over to the bridge over here because the commander says it, is not followership. That is going to ruin the unit cohesion. That is going to ruin the opportunity of the commander to build faith and trust in his troops, and reverse. Any command decision made by the commander is the sergeant's decision. If you remember in the movie Saving Private Ryan, there's a really good scene where they're walking through the fields of France, and one of the privates asks the captain, hey, don't you ever gripe? And Captain Miller says, no, never to you. There's a chain of command, and the gripes always go up. And that's really how it should be. Gripes always go up. The questions always go up. The sergeants own the commander's intent. The sergeants follow the commander's intent and never question it publicly in front of the men. And that's just military training, and that's just how I've been taught. At the bottom of the paper that I put together for tonight's meeting, I put together a list of duties of a volunteer sergeant, to include what they should be doing for pre-battle, what they should be doing once they arrive on the list, at lay-on, during battle. You don't have to do every single thing on these. These are just thoughts and ideas that occur to me, stuff that I've done on the battlefield or prior to any fights, to make sure that we are being as effective as possible. It is a lot of fun when the Army is working and working well. It is a whole lot of fun. And as a sergeant, standing in the line, I think one of my favorite memories is at the town battle at Gulf Wars, where I was a sergeant. And we were directed, 2nd Company, to hold the front of the fort and not let anybody come around the corner. And it was hard because we had a company of 40 guys, 30 guys waiting to go fight. But our duty and our responsibility was to hold that. And we held it. We took the bridge. We pushed everybody back. We held the choke point. And that made it easier for the rest of the Army and and everybody else on our side to do their job. And that's the important thing to remember. It may be fun and glorious to go through and rampage in the back of the enemy's lines, or to jump on a bunch of two chucks. But if that's not your job, you got to be willing to suck it up as a commander and as a sergeant, and say, no, that's not our job. We need to be here. This is our job right here, right now. So that's something that you need to think about as an NCO in the Volunteer Army. I went through that kind of rough and fast. If anybody has any questions, if they can't get to the paper and the notes, please let me know and I'll be willing to forward them. Open up at any time for questions, comments, concerns.
I have a comment. It actually kind of ties both of you guys' classes together. And that's about, and you mentioned specifically the whole concept of commander's intent, right? So when you're telling people to do things, I would tell you, and this actually speaks to Logan's very early question at the very beginning of this whole class, right? It's like, what's the jargon? I would tell you, don't use jargon, right? Speak specifically to individuals. Like, if I, as the commander, need a group of 20 guys to go do a specific job, I'm not going to say, hey, give me 20 guys to go do a certain job. I'm going to say, hey, John, go get 20 guys, and here's the job that I want you to go do.
Yep.
And once you do that, here's the next thing that you do. Right?
I totally agree. Yep.
I'm not going to use fancy words like, hey, do a big oblique march and stuff like that. If I want you to charge at a specific spot, I'm going to say, hey, I want you to hit their line about where that big fat guy with the blue tunic is. I know that doesn't super narrow it down in the SCA, but you get my point. Right?
There's a lot of big fat guys out there, Donngal.
So this is an instance where, addressing you specifically, heraldry works. That guy right there with the bear on his shield, I need him gone. That kind of plain language is exactly what we're talking about. It looks like John Lupo had a question. Knowing that no plan survives first contact, how do you know how to adjust your troops? What are you looking for when you're making those choices? So the 9 items that I covered are informing that choice, along with my previous experience, what I know of my enemy, what I can see in front of me at the time, and what my objectives are. If I can see in a take and hold scenario that the enemy line is thin, where I didn't expect it to be, I'm going to take advantage of that. I'm going to send in a quick charge. Dirk asks, do I weight the 9 tenets, or do they change as the needs change? So it's an interesting question. I haven't really put that into an SCA context. Certain of them are going to get a little bit more weight than others on an SCA battlefield, just because of the nature of SCA battle. I'm not necessarily concerned about the real world implications. In a lot of ways, you're pretty lucky because you can narrow your view to 100 yards deep and 50 yards wide. You're only looking at the size of a football field. I know that I can't get surrounded so long as I have some troops right against the edge of the world. It's not a possibility. So the weight is, how I weight those 9 is going to depend a lot on the scenario. It's going to depend a lot on, again, what I know of my enemy, what I know of my objective. I always have the concept of mass in my head, and I always have the concept of the offensive in my head. I think you can be very successful, though, as an SCA commander, so long as you keep the objective, attacking forward, and the simplicity in mind. So long as those 3 are active in your head at all times, you can be very successful. Looks like Hirsch has a comment.
I'd just like to chime in
Yeah.
for a moment. As a grunt, I've never really had any affinity for command, but I think the thing that both you and John have talked about that is the most important to me is letting everyone know what the objective is.
Absolutely.
If absolutely everyone knows what the objective is, then as the chain of command dies off, you still know what it is you need to do. And you can follow the guy next to you, or you can make the decisions, or whatever, however it ends up. But you know what the objective is, and you can see that thin point in the line and know that you're supposed to go take that flag. And since the line is so thin, you and the 5 guys around you can go get it.
Absolutely. Not just that everybody knows what the objective is, but everyone is kind of empowered in some way to, if necessary, take local command without being told how to achieve the objective. They have to make those choices based on the obstacles in front of them at the time. If we had 10 guys who very strictly followed all right, now I need you to advance to this tree and then attack that flank. If they follow that strenuously without any forethought on their own, then it can create a lot of problems. Well, thank you.
And having fought in other armies, namely Meridia's, I can say that that's one thing that we do very well is make sure that everyone has a clear picture of what the objective is going to be, and by doing so, as His Majesty said, it really does give the possibility for the lowest level member of the army to actually say, hey, our objective is to go do this, and I think we can go do it. Let's go grab it. In other words, hey, anybody want to go do something stupid with me?
Looks like Derek asks, what are the things you look for in the moment and how do you react? And he's asking both of us. So for me, in a command position, in a resurrection battle, for instance, I'm always looking to see how many people they have at res point. Before the battle, one of the things that Rolf taught me during my apprenticeship was pace off the battle and figure out how long it takes you at a decent walk to get from resurrection point back to the front, because that's how long it's going to take all of their guys to come back after a charge. That's how long you have to react. So what I'm looking for are those. I'm going to answer your question more specifically. Personally, I'm always looking for instances of numerical superiority. If I can create an instance of numerical superiority by sending 2 guys to tear off 5 and let the rest of my 15 guys have advantage, I'm going to take it. I am always looking for that.
For me, I'm always looking, beyond the front lines, scanning the enemy, seeing what they're doing. If they're piling up for a charge, I want to try to be having people in that position to accept the counter charge. If I see a weakness in the line, I'm going to tell the commander that, hey, we got a weakness here. Bridge battles, I'm always watching the other bridges, seeing how our other allies are doing. If it looks like the allies are starting to weaken some, I might peel off 4, 5, 6 guys, maybe a second line, and form a second line to right angles to keep us from being overwhelmed from the rear end. That's kind of what I'm doing, is I'm looking for the opportunities to make sure that I'm keeping our guys safe. And that's one of the things I take very much to heart, is once you're a sergeant, these are my guys, and I'm going to do everything I can to keep them safe.
It's also worth mentioning that eventually every battle, regardless of what the rule set is, every single one of them is eventually an attrition battle. a 45-minute res battle with 500 guys aside with unlimited resurrections is going to end up with about 100 guys on the field for both sides. Eventually, your numbers will whittle down. So how and when you spend your guys is important.
And then I think that really speaks to your mass as well.
I'm sorry, I keep saying guys. We have a lot of very talented female fighters in our army.
Guilty.
Donngal makes a great point here that not just understanding, it's not just important that everybody understands what the objective is, but why we're doing a specific thing. That way, when everybody's dead, when all the command staff is dead, the rest of the army still knows why they're doing what they're doing. Thank you, Your Grace, Ariel. So we're getting pretty close to time. I can talk about this all day. I'm happy to keep having questions. This is my bit of nerdery right here. So I can dive into this as deeply as we want to go. Seriously, I encourage you to go check out at least the website that I provided, some of the books. None of these books are expensive. The biggest one here I picked up for $5 at Half Price Books. So it's great material. It's not expensive, but a lot of it is offered free online too. The website that I provided has lots of great resources there, and it expands not just on the 9 tenets that we discussed, but all of the principles of strategy and tactics that the U.S. Army uses. Not all of it is going to be applicable. For instance, we're not going to have a real Air Force, but those things are there.
There was a question here from Hirsch, Your Majesty.
Yeah, please. How much weight do I put on weapons mix? Actually, go ahead and expand on your question, Hirsch.
It is working? Oh, good. I've had microphone problems. So how much weight do you put on weapons mix? Like if you're outnumbered, but all they have is sword and shields, and you have a weapons mix where you can take that range advantage even outnumbered, you know, how much does that play into your decision about whether or not to engage?
It's a good question, and it's difficult to answer right now because every time I've had to answer in the past, it needed to be answered immediately. I was on the field at the time and had to make choices with what I had. If I got to choose, if I got to build the Callantyr Army like Lego blocks, for me personally, I would have, let's call it 2 shieldmen, 2 polearmsmen, and a spearman, and that would be the primary block, depending on the battle. If you're looking at the ravine battle, which hopefully we're all familiar with at Gulf Wars, I would probably change that. I would drop 1 polearmsman for an additional spearman. Using your example of, let's call it 30 shieldmen versus a 15-man unit of mixed weapons. I like the weapons mix I described. Just enough shields to hold them still, with my spearmen harrying and my polearmsman hitting a flank.
Derek
Hopefully that answers your question.
Derek had a question about who do you recommend aspiring sergeants and commanders to talk to. Personally, for me, anybody with experience. I think that would be a good people to speak to. Anybody who's got command experience, and it doesn't have to be SCA wise. Like I said, I utilize a lot of my NCO training from the Air Force. That worked very well for me. You know, so Dirk is probably a good one to talk to about NCO leadership, being a sergeant in the Army.
We have had several very talented new sergeants recently in the past couple of years, and they've all taken great leadership from John, from Ronwin. Snorri's been a huge help in teaching. I guess if I had to suggest a single source that an aspiring sergeant might want to reach out to start that apprenticeship program, that they're all very, I keep calling them apprenticeship as if they're somehow structured. They're really not. They're very informal. But I would reach out to the War Council. They'll help people find someone local to them that could help further this education. Also, I encourage anybody who wants to or even thinks that this is something they really want to do. The next time we're allowed to have a melee event, step up as a potential leader. Nothing will get you further than experience, and doing it at home in the backyard with friends you trust is a great way to do that.
Can I add on that, Your Majesty?
Yeah, please.
I would, whatever level you are in the Army structure, because there's always people looking for work. There's a lot of people that want to do this job. Whether you're the crown putting together it from the top, or you're the general, whatever, you should always try to stagger levels of leadership with old experienced people and new people that are wanting to learn and get involved with this stuff.
When I say that I had an apprenticeship, I'll describe it really quickly so you can set expectations based on it. As a Feardman, Rolf was general, and I told him that I had some interest in SCA command, and before I knew it, I was at the commander's meeting, and I just kind of stood there and listened. And then when the meeting was over, we walked the battlefield together. We talked about what his philosophy of command was. And over the years basically by knowing him, I got to know some other people who had that level of interest. And over the years, I've had this conversation a lot, expanding my idea and my knowledge of what SCA combat really is with regard to melee combat. And somebody had always had something to teach me. It is super easy to get invited to go to a commander's meeting. No one likes to go to those alone. Just ask. Most people will be happy to have you. All right, we're long. Like I said, I'm still happy to chat about this if anybody else wants to. Yes, bring beer to the commander's meeting. Bribe your allies.
I prefer scotch, but that's okay.
Bring beer to every meeting,
Yes.
even if it's a cross meeting.
Especially a cross meeting. All right. You guys are welcome. Thank you for coming and listening to us ramble about our particular brand of nerdery. I'm happy to answer questions all day. So if you think of something later, let me know. John and I both provided documents that are linked in the chat section here. Read those. If you have questions, let us know. One of the items, my document is actually kind of long. I never actually covered. Several years ago when I was Donngal's general, I wrote for myself my own breakdown of what I thought those battles were going to look like and what they were going to need. I reviewed them right before each battle and just kind of reminded myself what my goals were for that battle and what the rules for that particular battle were. They're pretty interesting if you would like to go look at them. They're a little out of date. I stand by them as they were written at the time, but they're a little out of date now. So thank you.
I just want to follow on His Majesty. Thank you very much. I appreciate you guys giving us the opportunity to speak like this. And if anybody wishes to speak to me, feel free. I'm available.
So I would really like. Oh, Gustav got he beat me to it. So I was just going to say thank you, and I really appreciate what you guys did, and I will let Gustav continue.
Oh, no, I was just saying thanks, guys. I appreciate your time and all this wisdom and insight. This has been a pretty cool session. I really enjoyed it.
I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Your Majesty.
All right. Have a great evening. We'll talk to you soon.